blindfolded creatures walking around at night. This is us, and this is also me. I don't mind admitting that. At least that's how I really felt this week, and quite appropriately, having launched this podcast with 3 episodes about the struggle, about abandonment, about the difficulties of and with connecting with higher self, since this is what I really felt this week as I encountered further intimations of my own of disconnection, separation, and failure. And I'm going to go into how some of this unfolded for me, and in this way give you an insight into the dynamic living situation of walking with higher self in real time, in the midst of ordinary life, in the midst of new attempts, at least for me, at embodying and manifesting higher self in this life, here and now. You are listening to the Higher Self Dialogues with me, your host, Anton Jarrod, and welcome back. As you may already know, I recently launched this podcast to share the higher self journey, the expression of higher self as I experience it, as much as this stuff can be talked about. I mean, it's so difficult to find the words that reflect and express the reality, but it's okay. You work with what you've got. And a big part of this particular enterprise, at least initially, is about finding the right voice. It's a journey of discovery in itself. And I mean by this, finding my voice in speaking with and from higher self, speaking about this or that topic, and ensuring that I'm staying true to myself in this, and true to the deep fabric and order in which this enterprise is unfolding, okay? In a way, this whole first season is an experiment in higher self's ability to express itself in the here and now. How does the eternal, transcendent self express itself in English on this little planet sitting in the outer reaches of a spiral of the Milky Way, a higher self that is already at one with everything, though expressing itself through this tiny speck of a man that in my case is Anton Jarrod, that in your case is whoever you are. And who are you, by the way? Please let me know. And one thing amongst a few that I've yet to express is that this podcast is itself a living document, an evolving and unfolding testimony of that, of, as it were, the higher self's existence and expression. It's not a polished thing. It's not a perfect thing. I'm making mistakes in how I talk, and there's mistakes being made in how I'm expressing things, what I'm saying. And there are many things that are unclear, that are going to be unclear, that are challenging to express. And all of this forms part of the picture. Well, the main thing that I wanted to talk about this week in that expression or in that experience of feeling myself abandoned, separated and all of that, and not totally in tune with myself, was a criticism, a very slight criticism or comment that emerged with higher self, with myself, as I should emphasize. This will all make sense in a moment, okay, so bear with me. And it came on the back of the publication of the first 3 podcast episodes last week. So I've published these 3 episodes, and then in the following week, what comes up for me is this criticism or comment was that it's a bit strange to refer to higher self as a part, to express higher self in terms of partition. Wasn't realizing I was kind of doing this, but I did after receiving and hearing this. In the first 3 episodes, I spoke about the lower self joining with the higher self, feeling abandoned by the higher self, and so on. And here's what I captured of this expression from my actual journal. This is the part that I received through clairaudient psychic impression. The difference is I've never been described as ratio, part. So this I experience as coming from my higher self saying the difference is I've never been described as ratio, part. Now, don't let my poor expression be a distraction. This is just how I captured the intimation. Often when I'm doing this, my mind, my thinking apparatus is trying to formulate something that it can grasp of this intimation, this inner sensing. Yeah, higher self communicates something in something that might be in this particular instance something like speech, something like words, and it's apprehended by lower mind, which has access to terrestrial language, whatever languages you speak, which are in the purview of the lower self. But that translation from intuited or a form of intuition from higher self to the mental formation of lower self is never perfect. It's never precise. And perhaps you've experienced this yourself. When apprehending psychic experience and communication clairaudiently, the words are only hinting or capturing something of the reality, that the reality feels much bigger than what the words are expressing. So, well, I won't get too much into that, but the key point here is that there's this communication happening within. And since this is the higher self dialogues, it's my duty and honor and pleasure to share this, because this is exactly what the heart of this podcast is about. It's sharing this inner dialogue. And I hope that you'll get to kind of understand and see over time, if not straight away, that this dialogue with higher self is also, yes, in a deep way, dialogue with the wider self, because the self, every self, is a large country, a whole world, a whole universe, in fact. And there's always so much to it, so much. Let me delve into what is going on here with this particular impression, intimation that I had. The difference is I've never been described as a ratio, part. Well, the first thing to say about this comment about describing higher self in terms of ratio and part, as I now see I was doing in those first 3 episodes, is that it's kind of misguided. No, it is misguided. It's a distortion of reality. However useful and effective, and I would say sometimes necessary, given the constraints of human language. But here, I, as higher self, am saying, no, I'm not a part of the self. I can't be described as something to integrate, a part to connect with, and so on. And this is because, in truth, higher self is the self. It's the lower self, if anything, that's the part, in the sense of the hand being a part of the body. The lower self is fragmented and part focused from its own perspective. It's focused on parts and difference, and in this way it's predisposed to think of higher self as being just another part. And a lot of spiritual materials and books and teachings kind of take this approach, and that's totally understandable and in many ways valid, especially when one is beginning to evolve a sense of higher self. But from the higher self's perspective, no, this is not reality. It's just a relative reality. Don't introduce this distortion into the expression, because this is not the reality. It can be a kind of teaching aid for a time, but don't rely on it. I'm telling myself and intuiting and intimating within myself to not continue with this apportioning and this fragmentation, this expression of fragmentation of self. And this is a deep response to my own doing those first 3 episodes, focusing on this aspect of the self, the fragmentation of the self, which in its normal state in the animal kingdom is totally normal. It's from the animal kingdom that the evolution towards integration happens. So it's a reminder to me, and also to you, to not overemphasize a compartmentalized perspective of the self, even if it's normal and valid, even if it's part of the current discourse. And it's a lesson for me to keep trying to figure out a way of talking about higher self that is true to the integrated experience and state of being that I have, but that is also comprehensible to others. And this goes back to the point I made earlier, with this podcast being an exploration, and an imperfect one at that. I, in my whole self, am exploring and finding my feet here. And you're getting a fly on the wall view of this happening in real time. And that's really something special. In reality, everything is one, as the mind learns, at least abstractly, as a mental knowing. And higher self is the self that knows and experiences this. And so when I'm talking about my higher self, or without an article, just higher self, I'm talking about the higher self of us all. There's lots to think about there also. Again, words are poor tools when we start talking about spiritual reality. Of course, there's lots of different teachings, different ideas about all of this, but they're not really the focus in this podcast. I mean, I'll reference them, and I think that that's useful, and we can discuss them. But beyond a few explanatory notes, the main thing for me is to speak from, with, and as higher self, by which I mean with my awareness of this deeper state and reality and being. And in my whole self, I'm saying that I need to avoid too much of an emphasis on the idea of higher self being a part, a portion of self, as if it's some kind of percentage, like the self is made up of 33% higher, 33% unconscious self, and 33% lower self. No, such an analysis might be useful to an extent, but the amount of distortion of reality and understanding is too much to be tolerated. In reality, the self, if anything, is 100% higher self. In my room, I've got a beautiful bronze sculpture. It's about 70 centimeters high. And I think it's by a sculptor called Gaston Veuvenot-Leroux, or maybe Eugene Blot. It's an Egyptian-esque cold painted bronze of a sleeping maiden reclining on a pharaonic figural monument. Very nice. And the maiden is wearing a striped robe. I think it's from the 19th century. Doesn't belong to me, but to a dear friend of mine. And as I'm looking at it, doing this podcast episode, it's speaking to me of another way to picture the higher self and this whole idea of the part. In a way, the higher self is the whole sculpture, the pharaonic figure and the reclining figure. on it. But the reclining maiden, the lower self, in which is found the lower mind, the thinking apparatus that struggles with holistic thinking and expression, sees itself as part of a whole under ordinary circumstances. But the real job of the reclining figure of the lower self is to become the mouthpiece, the musical instrument, as it were, of the whole self. And this is what it must learn and practice. So, in reality, it's right to say my lower self, for the lower self is the part, the portion, in which my and I is speaking with as and from the higher self that I am. My own journey of integration and fragmentation has been a ride, I can tell you, and it's something that I've been actively journaling and chronicling for 20 years now, although my early journaling was very poor and sporadic. But since around 2008, 2009, I've been journaling quite extensively. So yeah, my journey, my story of integration and separation is written down, millions of words I could share with you. But this journey isn't over. It's ongoing, and I believe it will be ongoing for many lifetimes. And this is where I can talk about some spiritual teachings. I find the works of the Danish spiritual philosopher Martinus to be quite useful when thinking about the structure of spiritual reality. He writes about how a spiral cycle of evolution consists of 6 main kingdoms, which you might liken to densities or frequencies or vibrations, of which the animal kingdom is just one. It's one of these kingdoms, and it's the 3rd evolutionary space or domain in a sequence of 6 domains. Now, as far as I see it, the fullest experience of self as higher self, as highest self, that comes only in the 5th or 6th kingdoms in the spiral, in which the individuated sense of self is at its absolute minimum. It's still intact, it's still present, but it's of quite a different form and order as it's experienced in even higher spiritual worlds. So it's okay to have a primitive, youthful and childlike experience of higher self in the animal kingdom, in which the lower self gets it wrong, is finding its feet. It's learning to see itself in the mirror, as it were. And yeah, I would say even the most fully enlightened human beings are still just toddlers on this journey of evolution. As higher self, in these podcasts, I'm speaking of a wholeness and holism that is beyond understanding with the ordinary mind. It requires what you might call extraordinary mind to grasp it, which is within us all. It's nothing special. We all have this inner talent. It just requires experience of higher self for it to find ground in us. In many ways, we are all experiencing as higher self all the time, but we just don't realize it or think of experience in this way. And this is a case of the understanding needing to evolve. My own understanding also is evolving, by the way. I'm not coming to you as a finished product, and I'm not saying that I have all the answers at all. And I think that this is what's so interesting with this podcast, which for me is also a kind of an additional chronicle. Finding my voice, working things out on air, expressing things in one way only to share later that it's not quite like that, and sharing insights that both make sense but that also don't make sense. The strange expression of higher self the strange way that those forms of clairaudience and clairsentience and clairvoyance, the way that they come is something that I've gotten used to over the years, and that's also all part of this podcast. In the last weeks, I also experienced and attuned within to further forms of separation, to abandonment, on the back of talking about this last week. It's not a coincidence that I then experienced these intimations myself. And there's kind of a feedback loop going on, which of course I'm navigating this journey. I'm tuning in to intimations of failure, to losing myself, to not reaching transformational milestones that I've become aware of. And I'm working through all of this myself, working things out and finding my way to integrate everything. I'll give you an insight into one intimation, as I like to call it, from this week. And it was this: deconstruction is happening. These forms of clairaudient impression, they're often some of the most confusing and ambiguous forms of psychical experience. For me, this expression made me wonder about the world outside. I'm sure you'd think that deconstruction is happening all around us, it seems, in one way or another. And for me, this ties to many other intimations that I've had about war or world war, which I think are just always present as psychic forms. Whenever there's an expression within of destruction, then of course the ultimate destruction image is war, isn't it? And world war. So it's always present as a kind of archetype anyway. And it can just be purely that, symbolic, just as it can sometimes portend real events. But for me, this expression, deconstruction is happening, it had mainly the feeling of being about my inner life, of inner loss. I felt the pain of losing myself, of that I wasn't grasping something important, that I'd been delaying something that I should have picked up or moved on from, not making a shift when I should have, things falling apart within. This is a real present something that I was grappling with for some days, but then something firm underneath kept me from seeing or thinking that this was the total reality. And I shifted into understanding that yes, there was deconstruction within, but it was actually of a positive form. Forms of self were outdated, and it was those things that was deconstructing in the sense of coming apart and breaking down. These forms of self were outdated, they need overcoming, and it's about growing out of these. And this was, all in all, the real deep experience of this week. And this was something that really spoke deeply to me, as it connects with everything that's happening with me in my life, and old forms of self are falling away. So the first thoughts that I had about this, about it being a bad sign, being something terrible, failure, no, it wasn't that. It's actually something deeper, something more positive. There's always so many meanings and interpretations and lines of symbolism and relation that's drawn on, that, there's a whole life really that these intimations draw on. And the connection to the outer world isn't gone in this personal interpretation. I mean, for me, it's still there. There is a wider deconstruction going on that still has meaning. The intimation is still about that. For me, I do see, probably like many of you, that, yeah, there is this grand destruction and deconstruction going on. The idea of a changing world order, it's not just for niche thinkers now, it's mainstream political discourse. And in the old days, people with clairvoyant abilities would be decried as doomsdayers for talking about psychic visions of destruction, for, premonitions of war. But the truth and reality is so much more nuanced. There is destruction, even in the world, but it's also about renewal. It's about outgrowing something old, about becoming something new, something wiser, about growing up, becoming more mature. The self is a mirror for the world if you look and listen closely enough, and vice versa. So I will leave you with that. The self as a mirror, the world as a mirror. I really thank you for listening. Please do subscribe and follow to get notified of the next installment of this podcast. It really helps, where I share insights and intimations from my higher self to yours, to put it that way. You've been listening to the Higher Self Dialogues, written and produced by me, Anton Jarrod. Until the next time, goodbye.